What would happen if a defeated Nazi officer openly mocked the American flag just days before the war in Europe was over? Why would a man whose army had been crushed still feel confident enough to insult the very nation that defeated him? And what happened when those words eventually reached the desk of the most feared American general in Europe? April 1945, a captured German command bunkered deep in Bavaria. American MPs were processing a group of high-ranking German officers who had just surrendered after their defensive positions were overrun by Patton's Third Army. The Germans moved to the intake line, handing over weapons, removing insignia, and completing the routine procedures of captivity. Most were the familiar expression seen on many defeated Nazi officers in the final days of the war, a mixture of humiliation, bitterness, and lingering arrogance. Then one officer stopped in front of an American flag hanging on the wall. He stared at it for several seconds before making a comment in German that caused several fellow prisoners to smirk. An American lieutenant who spoke German was called over to translate. What he heard instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. The officer claimed that the American flag was nothing more than a symbol of merchants. He mocked the stars and stripes as symbols of money, profit, and commerce. Then he proudly declared that Germany's flag represented blood and honor, while America's represented business and wealth. Every American soldier within earshot froze. Some wanted immediate retaliation. But instead of reacting emotionally, one officer made a different decision. He ordered that every word be forwarded directly to General George S. Patton, because if anyone was going to answer this insult, it would be Patton himself. And what happened next would become a powerful lesson about national pride, military honor, and the difference between arrogance and true strength. The conflict in this story isn't simply between American soldiers and German prisoners. It's a battle over what a nation stands for. On one side is a captured German officer who still believes he can look down on the country that defeated him. Despite Germany's collapse, he continues to cling to the ideology and superiority that led Europe into catastrophe. On the other side are American soldiers who have spent years fighting across continents, losing friends, sacrificing comfort, and risking everything under the banner of the United States. When that banner is publicly mocked, the insult becomes larger than one flag hanging on a wall. It becomes a challenge to everything those soldiers fought for. The question is no longer whether the officer crossed a line. The question is how General Patton will respond. Will he ignore the insult? Will he punish the officer? Or will he find a way to prove exactly what the American flag truly represents? Because before the story is over, one man will learn that there is a huge difference between underestimating a nation and understanding it. Transition. As the report moved through military channels toward Patton's headquarters, few people expected the reaction it would trigger. The German officer believed he had delivered a clever insult. What he didn't realize was that his words had landed directly on one of Patton's deepest convictions. For Patton, this wasn't merely criticism from a defeated enemy. It was an attack on the soldiers who carried that flag through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. And as Patton read the report in silence, a response was already beginning to take shape. A response that would transform a careless remark into a lesson nobody present would ever forget. By April 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. German cities were falling one after another. Supply lines were shattered. Entire military formations were surrendering in massive numbers. The once feared Nazi war machine was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied forces advancing from every direction. American soldiers knew victory was close. Many of them had fought for years to reach that moment. They had crossed deserts, survived artillery barges, endured freezing winters, and watched friends die beside them. For most, the final weeks of the war were supposed to be about finishing the job and getting home alive. That was why the comment from Ober Friedrich von Schroeder seemed so strange. It wasn't a military threat. It wasn't an attempt to escape. It wasn't even important from an intelligence perspective. It was simply an insult. Yet the more people heard about it, the more it seemed to represent something larger. The German officer had spoken as if Germany still occupied the moral high ground. Even after surrendering, he acted as though America was somehow inferior. His words reflected a mindset many Allied soldiers had encountered throughout the war, a belief among certain Nazi officers that economic success, trade, and individual freedom were signs of weakness rather than strength. To them, military glory mattered more than prosperity. Power mattered more than liberty. Control mattered more than opportunity. And that was exactly why the remark bothered so many Americans. The men serving under the American flag were not professional conquerors. Most had been civilians before the war. Farmers, mechanics, teachers, factory workers, salesmen, truck drivers, and students had left ordinary lives behind when their country called. The very things a German officer mocked, commerce, business, and opportunity, were the lives many American soldiers hoped to return to once the war ended. The insult wasn't aimed at a piece of cloth. It was aimed at the values represented by that cloth. As news of the incident quietly spread among nearby units, reactions varied. Some laughed it off. Others suggested the prisoner was simply bitter. But many couldn't shake the feeling that something about the comment revealed a deeper arrogance. Here was a man whose nation lay in ruins, whose government was collapsing, whose army had been defeated on every front. Yet he still believed he could lecture Americans about honor. That contradiction fascinated people. The more they thought about it, the more they wondered how someone could witness the destruction of everything he claimed to believe in and still refuse to question it. Meanwhile, von Schroeder appeared completely unconcerned. According to several accounts from personnel who interacted with him, he maintained the calm confidence of a man who believed his social status and military background still placed him above those around him. He followed orders. He cooperated with procedures. But there remained an unmistakable sense of superiority in the way he carried himself. That attitude only made the original insult more memorable. Back at headquarters, the written report continued moving upward through channels of command. Most reports disappeared into stacks of paperwork. Most comments made by prisoners never reached senior leadership. But this one was different, because every officer who read it seemed to reach the same conclusion. Someone needed to see this. And eventually, that someone was George Patton. The question was whether Patton would dismiss the entire matter as the meaningless boasting of a defeated prisoner, or whether he would see something much larger hidden beneath those few careless words. As Patton studied the report, one detail kept bothering him. The German officer hadn't insulted American soldiers. He hadn't insulted American weapons. He had insulted what America itself stood for. And Patton was about to decide whether that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. By the time the report reached Patton's headquarters, most people expected it to receive little attention. After all, the war was entering its final chapter. Every day brought new operational challenges. Entire German formations were surrendering. Roads had to be secured. Prisoners had to be processed. Supplies had to be moved. Intelligence reports arrived by the hundreds. Compared to those responsibilities, one arrogant comment from a captured officer seemed insignificant. Yet something unusual happened. Instead of being forgotten, the report kept attracting attention. Officers who read it found themselves discussing it long after they had finished their other duties. The reason wasn't the insult itself. American soldiers had heard enemy propaganda for years. They were accustomed to criticism, threats, and boasts. What made this different was the timing. Germany had spent years trying to prove the superiority of its system through military force. It had launched invasions across Europe, imposed its rule on millions, and built an entire ideology around dominance and power. Now that system was collapsing. Yet even in defeat, some of its representatives refused to admit failure. To many Americans, that revealed something important. The German officer's statement wasn't merely an insult. It was evidence that some people still failed to understand why Germany had lost in the first place. As conversations spread through headquarters, soldiers began discussing what the American flag actually represented. For some, it represented family members waiting at home. For others, it represented opportunities unavailable in much of the world. Many had grown up with little money and difficult circumstances, yet they still believed they could build better lives through hard work. That belief wasn't something they considered embarrassing. It was something they considered worth defending. Ironically, the very qualities von Schroeder mocked were among America's greatest strengths. The factories that produced tanks, aircraft, trucks, ammunition, food, and fuel were products of commerce. The businesses he ridiculed had helped create an industrial machine capable of supporting Allied armies across multiple continents. The economy he dismissed had become one of the most powerful weapons of the war. Every jeep on the road, every artillery shell fired, every aircraft overhead served as evidence of that reality. Yet the German officer seemed unable or unwilling to recognize it. The more people examined his remark, the more they saw it as a reflection of the mindset that had led Germany into disaster. A belief that pride could replace practicality. A belief that ideology could overcome reality. A belief that appearances mattered more than results. Patton understood those dangers better than most. Throughout the war, he had studied his enemies carefully. He respected capable opponents, but he had little patience for arrogance detached from facts. And according to staff officers who knew him well, arrogance was exactly what he saw when he read von Schroeder's statement. Not confidence, not courage, arrogance. There was another factor as well. Patton had spent years motivating American soldiers. He knew what they had endured. He knew how many families had sacrificed sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers for victory. To him, criticism from a defeated Nazi officer wasn't offensive because it hurt feelings. It was offensive because it ignored those sacrifices. The officer had reduced an entire nation to a stereotype while standing as a representative of a regime responsible for immense destruction. That contradiction was impossible to ignore. As Patton continued reviewing the report, his staff noticed something unusual. He wasn't angry in the explosive way they had often seen before. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't issuing immediate orders. Instead, he seemed to be thinking. And whenever Patton became quiet, experienced officers knew something important was coming, because the most significant decisions often emerged from those moments of silence. Patton now faced a choice that nobody else had considered. He could simply ignore the insult and move on, or he could turn one German officer's arrogance into a lesson that every prisoner and every American present would remember for the rest of their lives. What nobody knew was that Patton had already begun forming a response. As Patton continued thinking about the incident, his attention shifted away from the German officer himself. Von Schroeder was only one man. In a few months, he would be just another prisoner in a defeated army. His rank, his status, and the authority he once enjoyed would mean very little. What interested Patton was the idea behind the remark. Why would an officer from a collapsing regime choose to mock commerce, business, and prosperity? Why would he see those things as weaknesses rather than strengths? The more Patton considered the question, the more he believed the answer revealed something important about the entire conflict that had consumed the world for 6 years. The Second World War had never been only about territory. It had also been a struggle between different visions of society. One system believed individuals existed primarily to serve the state. The other believed the state existed to protect the freedom of individuals. One glorified control. The other encouraged opportunity. One demanded obedience. The other accepted disagreement. Those differences often seemed abstract when discussed in political speeches, but on battlefields, their consequences became very real. American soldiers came from every imaginable background. Some were rich, some were poor, some came from large cities, while others grew up in remote farming communities. They spoke differently. They worshiped differently. They held different opinions. Yet they fought under the same flag. That diversity sometimes created challenges, but it also created strength. Patton had witnessed that strength repeatedly throughout the war. He had seen mechanics become heroes, farm boys become tank commanders, former factory workers lead men through combat under impossible conditions. America's military power didn't emerge from a rigid social class system. It emerged from ordinary citizens given extraordinary responsibilities. That reality stood in direct contrast to the worldview reflected in von Schroeder's comment. The German officer seemed to believe commerce was something shameful. Patton saw it differently. To him, commerce represented productivity. Productivity created resources. Resources sustained armies. And armies won wars. The connection seemed obvious. Without American factories, Allied forces could not have operated on the scale required to defeat Germany. Without American industry, millions of soldiers could not have been equipped. Without American economic strength, victory might have remained out of reach. In other words, the very thing the German officer mocked had played a major role in Germany's defeat. That irony was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Word continued spreading through military circles. Officers discussed the incident during meals. Soldiers mentioned it in conversations. Some wondered whether Patton would address the matter personally. Others assumed he had already forgotten about it. Few realized that Patton was examining the issue from a broader perspective. He wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about symbolism. Throughout history, symbols had influenced morale, loyalty, and identity. Flags inspired people to endure hardships they might otherwise avoid. They reminded soldiers what they were fighting for. They connected individuals to something larger than themselves. That was why attacks on symbols often carried unusual emotional weight. The American flag represented far more than government institutions. For countless soldiers overseas, it represented home, the farms they missed, the families waiting for letters, the communities they hoped to see again. When viewed through that lens, von Schroeder's insult seemed even more disconnected from reality. He saw a flag. American soldiers saw everything attached to it. As Patton reviewed reports and continued his daily responsibilities, a decision slowly began taking shape. It would not involve shouting. It would not involve revenge. And it would not involve violence. Instead, it would force the German officer to confront something he had completely misunderstood. The only question was whether von Schroeder would recognize the lesson when it arrived. While Patton was forming his plan, the German officer remained confident that his remark had been forgotten. But within headquarters, preparations were beginning, and soon, von Schroeder would find himself standing face to face with the very man whose nation he had mocked. What Patton intended to do next would surprise everyone involved. When General George S. Patton finally decided to act, it was not announced with drama or spectacle. There were no speeches prepared, no public warnings issued, no immediate punishment ordered through official channels. Instead, the decision moved through quiet military precision. Orders were sent, personnel were informed, and the necessary arrangements were made to bring the German prisoners under closer observation. Among them was Oberfriedrich von Schroeder. For most prisoners, the days after surrender followed a predictable rhythm: processing, interrogation, transfer, and waiting for eventual relocation to prisoner camps. But in this case, something changed in the atmosphere. Officers who normally treated prisoners with routine detachment now seemed more attentive. There was an unspoken awareness that something unusual was unfolding behind the usual structure of military procedure. Von Schroeder himself did not appear concerned. If anything, he seemed reassured by the predictability of the system. He had survived the war. He had survived capture. In his mind, survival itself confirmed a certain level of superiority. Many officers like him believed that discipline and training had protected them, even in defeat. But what he did not understand was that he had already become part of something larger than his own perception of events. The report about his comment had not been dismissed. It had reached the highest level of command in the theater. And now, Patton was directly involved. Known throughout the Allied forces for his intensity, Patton was not a man who ignored challenges to his authority, his soldiers, or the principles he believed defined America's strength. Yet his response in this case was not immediate punishment. It was deliberate, controlled, calculated. Those who worked closely with him understood this pattern. When Patton was silent, he was rarely inactive. He was usually evaluating not just what had happened, but what it meant in a broader sense. In this situation, he was not simply dealing with an insult. He was dealing with ideology. And ideology, in Patton's view, could not be answered with emotion alone. It had to be answered with clarity. As arrangements were made, the German officer was brought into a controlled environment where senior personnel were present. The atmosphere was different from standard prisoner processing. There was less noise, fewer distractions, a noticeable absence of casual conversation. Everything felt intentional. Von Schroeder noticed this change, but interpreted it differently. He assumed it was a matter of importance related to intelligence or administrative review. He did not yet realize that the focus had shifted from him as a prisoner to him as an example. Then Patton arrived. His presence alone altered the room. There was no need for introduction. Everyone already knew who he was. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he observed, not just the prisoner, but the environment, the reactions of those present, and the subtle dynamics in the room. When he finally addressed the situation, his tone was controlled rather than explosive. That alone made it more unsettling. Patton was known for anger, for forceful language, for decisive action under pressure. But here, something different was happening. He was choosing restraint. And restraint from Patton carried its own kind of weight. The German officer, for the first time, seemed uncertain, not afraid in the obvious sense, but aware that he no longer controlled the meaning of the moment. Patton had not come to debate him. He had come to redefine the situation entirely. Every assumption von Schroeder held about superiority, dignity, and national pride was about to be tested in a way he had not anticipated, because Patton was no longer interested in what had been said. He was interested in what it revealed, and what revealed, in his mind, went far beyond one man's arrogance. It pointed directly to the mindset that had led an entire nation into ruin. Von Schroeder believed he was still speaking as an equal, even in defeat. But standing in that room, with Patton watching in silence, he was about to learn that some lines, once crossed, cannot be defended with words. And Patton had not yet delivered his response. The room was still when Patton finally spoke, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. Every person present understood that whatever came next would define the meaning of the moment far more than the German officer's original insult ever could. Von Schroeder stood with the posture of someone trying to maintain dignity under observation. He had survived battlefields, interrogations, and the collapse of an entire regime. In his mind, this still placed him in a category above ordinary men. But Patton was not looking at him as an equal. He was looking at him as an example. The German officer's earlier comment about America being a nation of merchants had been delivered in confidence, almost with amusement. He had expected it to be dismissed, or at worst, to provoke anger from lower-ranking soldiers. He did not expect it to reach the level of command, and he certainly did not expect General Patton himself to stand in front of him. Patton's response was not immediate anger. It was something far more dangerous to men like von Schroeder, controlled certainty. He began by addressing the idea, not the man. A nation judged by commerce, he said in essence, is judged by what it produces, what it builds, and what it sustains, not by what it destroys. There was a pause after that. The words were simple, but they carried weight that filled the room. Patton did not need to argue that America was superior. He did not need to list victories or statistics. The outcome of the war itself already spoke loudly enough. Instead, he focused on the contradiction in the German officer's worldview. A system that glorified honor had ended in devastation. A system that mocked commerce had been defeated by industrial capacity. A system that claimed moral superiority had collapsed under the consequences of its own aggression. Then Patton turned slightly toward the prisoner. The tone remained steady, but there was now a sharper edge beneath it. He made it clear that the flag the German officer had mocked was not merely a symbol of business or profit. It was a representation of a country that had mobilized its entire structure, economic, industrial, and human, to confront a global threat. Factories had not been symbols of greed. They had been instruments of survival. Trade had not been weakness. It had been the foundation of power that allowed millions of soldiers to be equipped, transported, and sustained across continents. Without that system, the war would not have ended as it did. The silence in the room deepened. Even those who had heard variations of these ideas before understood that Patton was not delivering a lecture. He was delivering a final statement. Von Schroeder, for the first time, showed visible discomfort, not because he was being insulted, but because his certainty was being dismantled piece by piece without emotion, without theatrics, and without the comfort of ideology. Patton then addressed something deeper. Respect is not measured by slogans or symbols. He implied, it is measured by results. And results were already visible. The German army had been defeated. The regime had fallen. The cities lay in ruin. And the war was ending under Allied control. Whatever pride von Schroeder believed he still carried did not change those facts. There was no shouting, no dramatic punishment, no physical confrontation, just a quiet weight of reality being stated clearly in front of everyone present. And that was what made it final. By the time Patton finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The earlier arrogance from the prisoner had collapsed into silence, not forced silence, Real silence. The kind that comes when belief stops matching reality. Patton did not continue further. He did not need to. The message had already been delivered, and everyone in the room understood that the insult, which had once seemed important, no longer carried the same meaning, because now it had been answered not with anger, but with undeniable perspective. But what happened after Patton left the room would raise a question few people expected. Was this really about one German officer's arrogance? Or was it about how nations define their own strength in the first place? And the answer would reveal something far bigger than anyone in that bunker realized. In the days that followed, the incident involving Ober Friedrich von Schroeder faded from immediate attention inside the military routine of occupied Germany. The war in Europe was ending rapidly. German resistance was collapsing across multiple regions, and Allied forces were shifting from combat operations to occupation, stabilization, and processing of millions of prisoners. Events were happening too quickly for any single moment to remain central for long. But within certain circles, the story was not forgotten, not because of the insult itself, but because of what it revealed about perception, pride, and the way defeated enemies often reinterpret the systems that overcame them. Von Schroeder's remark about the American flag being a symbol of merchants was rooted in an ideology that had already been discredited by the outcome of the war. It represented a worldview that measured strength only in military terms, while dismissing economic power, industrial capacity, and social mobility as lesser forms of influence. Patton's response, however, highlighted a different reality. He understood that modern warfare was not won by ideology alone. It was won by production, coordination, adaptability, and the ability of an entire society to mobilize resources at scale. In that sense, the very system mocked by the German officer had proven decisive in his nation's defeat. That contradiction is where the deeper lesson of the story lies. Patton's approach also reflected something important about leadership under pressure. He did not respond impulsively in public anger. He did not turn the incident into a spectacle of punishment. Instead, he transformed it into a controlled demonstration of perspective. That choice carried both strengths and risks. On one hand, it preserved discipline, authority, and clarity. It avoided unnecessary escalation and reinforced the reality of defeat without emotional excess. On the other hand, critics of Patton's leadership style have often argued that his reliance on symbolic dominance and psychological pressure sometimes blurred the line between discipline and intimidation. This incident sits within that broader pattern. Was Patton right? From a military perspective, his response was effective. It neutralized arrogance without creating disorder, and it reinforced Allied authority at a critical transitional moment. From a moral perspective, it is more complex. While he did not act with physical cruelty, the psychological weight of confrontation between victor and defeated prisoner raises questions about power dynamics even after conflict ends. But regardless of interpretation, one fact remains clear. The incident was never really about a flag. It was about what that flag represented. To the German officer, it was easy to dismiss America as a nation driven by commerce, because that interpretation reduced a complex society into something simple and mockable. But to American soldiers, that same commerce represented opportunity, survival, and the ability of an entire nation to support a global war effort on an unprecedented scale. The lesson extended beyond World War II. It speaks to how nations define strength. Some define it through conquest. Others define it through endurance. Some define it through ideology. Others define it through results. And history tends to remember which definition actually lasts. In the end, von Schroeder's comment did not weaken the American flag. If anything, it revealed why it mattered so deeply to those who fought under it. Because symbols only hold meaning when they are backed by lived experience. And for the soldiers who had carried that flag through some of the hardest battles in modern history, it was never just a symbol of merchants. It was a symbol of everything they had endured and everything they had survived to defend. As for Patton, the incident became another reflection of his broader legacy. A commander who believed that war was not only fought with weapons, but also with perception, morale, and absolute conviction in one's cause. And whether one agrees or disagrees with his methods, his influence on how victory was achieved in Europe is undeniable. The war ended. The regime that mocked its enemies collapsed. and the flag that was insulted continued to fly over a nation that had helped reshape the world order. Sometimes, the strongest response is not rage. It is reality itself. And reality, in this case, had already delivered its verdict long before any words were spoken. In the end, the story is not just about Patton. It is about how strength is defined and who gets to define it. And once that question is answered, everything else becomes just noise.